Alrighty, we'll kick off then. So welcome back, everyone. It's delightful to have you back both online and in person. It was great to see the level of interaction and the joy and enthusiasm and general level of noise that we could hear from the networking over morning tea. So in the sessions this morning, we got some great insight into opportunities for Sydney, some amazing ideas and some real insight into what we could be, what we've got the potential to be. In the upcoming sessions, we want to delve deeper into some of the big issues that we really need to address if we're going to be one of the greatest cities in the world. We need to be united, we need to address inequality, and we need to think of ourselves on a global stage. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Praz Kumar, the Vice President and Executive Director of Operations from our major sponsor Jacobs, to introduce our first panel of the day.
Thank you, Sue. I second your thoughts. It was an amazing day so far. Just a little bit on Jacobs for everybody. We're a major sponsor, obviously, of the Sydney Summit, as mentioned today. We're really pleased to be here and to help bring this forum to life, along with PwC, the Sydney Morning Herald, Urbis, SEC Newgate, and of course the Committee for Sydney. For those not familiar with Jacobs, I'd like to share just 3 things about us. The first is that we're a global solutions provider with over 55,000 people worldwide, spread across the globe, providing a full spectrum of professional services. The second thing is that you may not know us for, or most commonly know us for, is that we're engineers and scientists working on big design and construction projects. That was Jacobs 5-6 years ago. But in more recent years, we've become dramatically more diverse with creative technologists, esports specialists, biomimicry experts, architects, data and digital science specialists, health and well-being planners, as well as many human and country-centred designers coming on board. And finally, this transformational journey over the last 5 years has changed the way how we work as a company, now both within and with our partners in industry. The discussion is very relevant to today. It's shifting from what we are building to who we are designing this for and how we can deliver broader outcomes for our communities to spread prosperity and enhance well-being for all. And most beautifully, this really aligns with our values and our objectives as a company. Our vision and our brand promise is to create a more connected and sustainable world. You might recall the committee published a report several years ago looking at the inequalities across our city and what changes could lead to a healthier and more prosperous city for all. Well, we've all been living the twists, as you heard today, and we've seen all the data and the statistics around livability and the challenges that you, I, everyone else in this room and outside of this room has been facing over the last couple of years. The divide is still real, and for some, getting wider. What do we need to do to ensure these inequalities do not become a permanent part of our social fabric? I'm delighted to introduce Professor Peter Shergold, Chancellor of Western Sydney University, to chair this critical conversation about how we nurture social cohesion and build better communities. I'll leave it to Peter to introduce his esteemed panel. Please make them welcome.
So I'm Peter Shergold. I am the Chancellor of Western Sydney University. I have no jacket, I have no tie, and that is, of course, because I am your post-COVID active transport curbside sort of guy. I walked here this morning, and to show what a risk taker I am, I didn't wear a helmet. Now, for at least 30,000 years, the area that is now Sydney, the rich hunting and fishing lands bordered by the ocean and including the Georges, Nepean, Hawkesbury and Parramatta rivers, was cared for by some 29 Aboriginal clans we now know collectively as the Eora Nation. And that land, that unceded land, has now become a great city, a sprawling global metropolis, born and shaped by its history of successive waves of colonial and post-colonial settlement. But what exactly is Sydney? We tend to think of urbanisation as an environment that's been moulded by generations of physical infrastructure, which has been constructed to house and employ its residents and its workers. Too rarely do we fully appreciate that a city is far more than that physical reality. Rather, in a real sense, it is what we imagine it to be. How, when we think of Sydney, do we envisage the communities and the manner in which they are connected? Of course, the built infrastructure and the preserved parklands and beaches serve to shape our imagination of the city we live in, but equally important, it is our imagination that actually shapes the city. Often it is our unconscious perceptions and the stereotypical images that we carry in our heads that create our sense of Sydney. And in creating that, gets us to think of Sydney and about Sydney. And that, in turn, affects how we plan for the future of the Sydney. It can distort how we arrange and prioritise the distribution of public and private resources. So Sydney, like other great metropolises around the world we've heard of this morning, is an amalgam of its distinctive constituent parts. And like other great migrant cities, it's an amalgam in which communities of geography are overlaid with communities of race and ethnicity and faith. The sense of place, associated with neighbourhood, is as much represented by the people as the buildings and the local government borders. Sydney, how do we describe? Well, Sydney, we're told, is a city of villages. And then beyond the villages, a widening network of suburbs and LGAs stretching to a receding peri-urban fringe. Sydney, according to the Greater Sydney Commission, should best be considered a connected urban space of 3 distinctive Sydneys, or as we've heard this morning, part of a 6-city polycentric mega-region. And in Sydney, it divides between the eastern harbour city, that still dominates how most people overseas think of Sydney, and what's extraordinary, still dominates how many people in Sydney think of Sydney, the eastern harbour Sydney, and then the central river city and the western parkland city. But you know, I'm sure of this, still in popular imagination in Sydney, the most enduring and entrenched urban demarcation of all is between Western Sydney, on the one hand, and the eastern suburbs and the northern beaches and the CBD and the inner west on the other. Now, here's the truth. Based on postcode disadvantage, it is true, it is still true, that the people of Greater Western Sydney, Parramatta, Bankstown, Blacktown, Fairfield, Campbelltown, Liverpool, Penrith, those people are still, in general, I emphasise, in general, comparatively disadvantaged in Sydney. They do have lower incomes, they do have fewer skills, they do have less education, they do have poorer access to medical facilities and to cultural institutions and to tree canopy and so on and so on and so on. But here's the other truth. Those distinctions, those inequities are overall closing over time. The fact is that what is still in the public imagination, I think, the sort of hard-bitten, tough, gritty Western Sydney, is rapidly becoming the fast-growing, fast-developing boomtown Sydney. Indeed, I would argue that Western Sydney is Sydney's greatest urban transformation success story. Think about it. Here is an area that in the 1970s, when I came to Australia, was an area of traditional small to medium manufacturing industry that has virtually disappeared. It was an area of small-holding agriculture in the peri-urban fringe, which has largely disappeared. And then it's become home to increasing numbers of Aboriginal people, non-English speaking background migrants and refugees. Now, I tell you, if I talk to people in the United States or the United Kingdom, they already know in their mind what Western Sydney is. It's Rust Belt. And yet we know it's nothing like that. That is the area that's transformed. And partly, I'd say in parentheses, because of Western Sydney University. Western Sydney, of course, in some ways, is already now the heartland of Sydney. It's the heartland of our construction industries, the heartland of our logistics industries. When we went through lockdown, the Eastern Harbour City soon realised that. But in part because of the developments of Western Sydney Airport or Westmead and so on, it is now becoming the home of high-tech advanced manufacturing and biomedical research-based industries and media and digital communication, and it's even got the grooviest 21st century urban word, aerotropolis, that really excites me until I remember back to the multifunction polis. But the aerotropolis really does beckon a different future. So my panel's going to consider how can we now start to imagine that a city that is Sydney, that's diverse and diversified, but not divided. A city that, in Minister Stokes's address this morning, is united but separate. In other words, a single, cohesive, cosmopolitan centre, united both by physical infrastructure and social cohesion and a shared sense of civic pride. So I'm now going to talk to my panellists. And I'm going to go first to yourself, Natalie, if I can. Natalie is the Social Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission. And look, I think it's been a great step forward, I've got to say, Natalie, getting to get people in Sydney to start to perceive of Sydney as three, if you like, interlocking Sydney. But what is it now, in your view, that's going to, in a sense, make a healthy, vibrant, united Sydney?
Great question. Thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. Well, firstly, I think we need to start seeing ourselves as 6 cities as part of the Sandstone region, as the Minister described it this morning, and I think that's really important to help us see us connected to Newcastle, Central Coast, Illawarra, and everything in between. But I think for me, what is a healthy and vibrant Sydney is one that is not just about the things as you described. It's not just about the places we want to be. It's not just about the waterways, the parks, the buildings. And it's not just about the acts, the things that we do, our jobs, the entertainment, the recreation, but it's about the people. And it's about our diverse people. And of course, I would say that because I'm the Social Commissioner for the soon-to-be Greater Cities Commission. I fundamentally believe that is the thing that has been missing for so long from the planning for Greater Sydney. And that is, if once we understand that, that is what will take us from being good to great. And I just think about a couple of things, and really 3 things that I think are really important for us to understand to centre Sydney's diverse peoples within its future. The first is that we really need to understand the diversity, and not just from an atomised survey of community sentiment, but really understand what is it that the different and diverse communities and peoples within Sydney, how is it that they're living their lives at the moment? And how do they want that to be different for the future? Or the same, they may want it to be the same. Rather than us thinking about a city that is beautiful and pristine from a planning perspective, but actually doesn't work for the single mum with 4 kids who needs to do 3 drop-offs at school, to daycare and school before getting to her part-time job in the city if she lives out in Western Sydney. So we need to think about the ambition that Sydney's peoples have for themselves. And that ambition is not just about what they want to get out and what we want to get out of the Sydney, but how we see ourselves in it and what we want to contribute as well. And that leads me to the second point around, and I think we've all safely say this coming out of COVID, we've lived very small lives over the last 2 years. There's been a lot of hardship that has come with that, but I think from my own experience, the benefit that has come from that is reconnecting to my local community. And I think what it's brought into stark reality is that for those of us who are part of a local connected community, there is support and there's safety and there's cohesion. But if you don't have that and that is missing, that does amplify the struggle that you're experiencing. So I think making sure that there's a distributed network of social infrastructure throughout our city is so important. And that enables access to the things we want to have, the acts we want to do, the jobs we want to have and participate in, the homes we want to live in. And then the third thing is, and I'll end on this point, is we've got to elevate our First Nations histories and cultures. And I think that only makes us a much better city once we acknowledge and recognise not just the historical caretaking and custodianship of Greater Sydney by its First Nations peoples, but also how that understanding and knowledge can take us forward to go from good to great as Greater Sydney.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a really great start. I've got to follow up this idea of, of people and social infrastructure. I think with Lindy. Lindy Dietz is the General Manager out at Campbelltown City Council. She's someone that I've learned so much about Western Sydney. Let me go right for the big one. Lindy, is there somebody out there is a Westie? Are the Westies a distinctive group from your point of view?
No, I had a very strong upbringing with my culturally diverse family that said people are people. So no, I don't think there's such a thing as a Westie. If I described the community of Campbelltown, they are generous, diverse and cohesive community, richly blessed with a large and increasing Aboriginal population, plus very diverse cultural diversity. They're actually very highly skilled, surprise, surprise, and actually very well educated as well. And that can be seen in the higher education rates, tertiary qualifications increasing year by year. The greatest challenge, however, I think, for our community is that if I paint you a little picture, 62% of our community have to leave home every day and leave the LGA to find a higher order job. 67% of our community have to do that by car because the public transport network hasn't kept up with the urban sprawl. Another shocking statistic is that 15% of our households do not have access to internet. So I think that it's fair to say that the gap is closing, but there are some very significant pillars that need some really serious addressing. It is quite normal for a member of our community to have to commute 2 to 3 hours a day. So imagine that stress that puts on families, on mental health, on housing stress, on all of those things that make people happy and healthy. So there is definitely things that need serious addressing, but we're actually pretty wonderful people in Campbelltown.
So I think Linda and I are the same, and I think we both share the view that the biggest single remaining disadvantage now faced by people in Western Sydney is this having to commute long distances for employment. I can reiterate a point. I did a survey of Western Sydney University students, most of whom come from Western Sydney, postgraduate destinations. 6 months after they've left, 66% are still living in Western Sydney. I think they want to live in Western Sydney. Only 33% have found their employment in Western Sydney. That really is the challenge we face. We often talk about it, as a congestion tax, but I think the impact on people is huge. I might turn to you, Ian Hickey, because I know you've been thinking about this a great deal. I mean, can we just go to that sense of once you start to have that huge incursion into people's personal time, does it have wider implications?
Yes. So I spend my life tied up with trying to measure the mental health and well-being, not just of individuals, but of communities. And I think we've all had this demonstrated by the pandemic experience. We don't exist in isolation. We are not islands. And the measures we are trying to have introduced into economic discourse are of mental wealth. I'm sure you're all preoccupied whether we'll have a 5, a 4 or a 3 in front of the employment figures by the end of the year, or the unemployment figures, or the size of GDP. We're trying to measure the mental wealth of the community. And there are measures and there are ways of doing that. And it's tied up in how much time and how much connection people have in their everyday lives with others, how cohesive they are. I don't know about you, but I was struck by the Ipsos survey, if I've got it right, that only a third of people said that they were satisfied with their degree of social cohesion. To me, that's like an unemployment rate of 10%. There's something seriously wrong in people's lives if only a third of them. And there wasn't a big difference between East and West, interestingly, in that. I think it's much more nuanced in terms of place. Campbelltown's not the same as Liverpool. It's not the same as Blacktown. It's people's sense of place, how much time they spend in that place. There's been a lot of discussion this morning at a really good micro level. I love the idea about Campsie and about curbs, and that people are in markets, they're in places, they're in public transport, not in private cars. They're in day-to-day interaction. I was discussing with Maha, if you're in the grandparent or great-grandparent generation, how much time you spend with your grandchildren, how much time they spend with you, how much that interaction takes place in community settings. So I think we have to change the discourse from that just being a nice idea to one that's a real health value in the discourse I'm in, but actually in this setting, to economic value. And what you've seen in countries like the United States where social cohesion is low, what a disaster it is when you're trying to respond to these kind of issues and the effect not just on the economy, but on the society. What we have had in Australia traditionally, we believe we have a higher sense of shared values and of cohesion, but I think the pandemic has raised the issue, do we? And is it the same in different places as we develop a better sense of place-based community, a sense of interaction? When I'm not in downtown Redfern, in fact, where there's high social cohesion in the apartments I'm in, I'm actually, as some people know here, a lot of time on the Central Coast during the pandemic. But tens of thousands of adult males leave the Central Coast every day to work in the city. And they spend 3 to 4 hours commuting, largely in cars, largely in four-wheel drives, and in backwards and forwards. That has a terrible impact on that community on an ongoing basis. But that's how jobs are figuring out. It's a discussion that Peter and I were having earlier on. High-value jobs in the care economy. If Sam Mostyn was here with us this morning, in childcare, in aged care, in healthcare, and in the industries that surround that, they are not low-skilled, low-paid jobs. They're jobs of very high international value, but they require training and assessment, and they have other skills and other developments. Biotech, a lot of AI that I'm tied up with, a lot of other infrastructure tied up with it. They are very highly valuable jobs that deliver economically, but socially. And the two really impressive ministers heard this morning, one's talking about one that's really important, gender equality and early childhood education. Just on that one, I'm tied up with the Minderoo Foundation currently about early childhood education. It's not flashcards. It's not numeracy literacy. It's actually development of cultural identity and sense of connection for life. And it's very place-based and it's very community-based. And we have got to get into that. In Australia, Jay Weatherill, the ex-South Australian Premier, runs Thrive by 5, funded by the Minderoo Foundation, but not just school readiness for individual capability. It's for functional members of a connected society. So I think, Peter, we have to turn that into economics, put it up against all those things about curbside value of this, then, that thing. Actually, what's the value of people spending time together in connected communities? What's the value of caring? What's the value of intergenerational connection? And how do we then have social policies, like the Treasurer was talking about this morning, and then the hard infrastructure people? How do we get the hard infrastructure people to talk about the social return on investment through things like measuring the mental wealth that we can build?
Thank you. That's a great segue, because I want to now come to Maha Abdo, who's the CEO of the Muslim Women's Association. I've had the opportunity to work with her quite a bit in my role as a Coordinator General for Refugees here in New South Wales. But Maha, I know this goes absolutely to the heart of your thoughts about, well, what is it that makes that sense of community? So sure. I wonder what your views are.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to sincerely acknowledge the traditional owners that we stand on here, and I think that gives me just sort of thinking and imagining what it would be like. It really doesn't take much for me, because I've just got to look at a small child, my grandchild over the weekend, thinking he wanted to go and see his great-grandmother. And to me, a city or a community is made up of all parts, not one part or the other. But before we do that, I think we need to think about some of the trauma that's had an effect on certain parts of Sydney, and how healing is so important. If we really think about, how we're going to sort of imagine no more divide. It's about inclusiveness. It's about sincere inclusiveness. There's so much parts to this whole of the aspect of belonging and identity. Because when I feel I belong to something, and that's where I hear it over and over again from young people, even older women say, I've been living in this house, in this suburb for over 60 years. All of a sudden, over COVID, I felt as if I did not belong. So these are some of the issues I think we've got to look at. It's about not just belonging, it's about being empathetic, not feeling sorry, and about changing, shifting the way we perceive people, as clearly what has been discussed here and earlier this morning. It's about perception, it's about language. When we talk about them, it's the other, on the other side of Sydney. Last year and over COVID, we could see we were the most cohesive. There were amazing social cohesive, things happening that were sort of created within without creating a village. That you had to, because you had a very small, sort of parameters that you could walk outside or drive outside. You couldn't even go to the beach. You couldn't So we had some of us had the Georges River. So we really made, not me, but young people, young and old people got together with children to make safe, secure spaces. But at the end of it, I think it's not about recognising that this is being done, but it's really recognising that there is power to individuals within communities. And it's not about us giving power to them. It's about recognising the power that they have, and they're feeling responsible that they can contribute. And contribution is not just about, social cohesion, about, my mental health and well-being. It's about overall structure of a community that belongs to the city, that belongs to the country, that belongs to the world. So therefore, we are part of the whole. And to really go back to what Ian was talking about, the mental wealth, I think that's something that's just sort of, for me, it's just so much richness in mental wealth, and how much value do we put on that? That's where I see a vibrant, place of community, but most importantly, we've got to really consider how do we take on that steps and strategy of healing before anything else.
So the interesting question we've got, I suppose, is how do we create this vision of a greater Sydney, or in fact this greater region incorporating Newcastle and Wollongong, and accept that it is diverse, geographically diverse, multicultural, and with those particular sense of communities, some of which may be ethnic or faith-based, some of which may be neighbourhood-based. How do we do that and yet create that sense of unity in which people within Sydney don't think them and us, so that, the next time we want to build a major cultural facility in Parramatta, the Powerhouse Museum, it doesn't end up with new letters to the Sydney Morning Herald saying, don't take that away from the eastern suburbs and the inner west. How do we do that? Natalie, any ideas? given you've got a lot of the responsibility.
Thanks, Peter. I think we have to lead by example. We can't talk in this divisive language. We have to act in an inclusive way. We have to think inclusively, and it starts with seeking out the views of community, but also, as Maha said, acknowledging that and recognising that things are being done already within community, that people are already they've built villages, they have their social cohesion, that maybe we're just not recognising it. And we need to really embrace that and recognise that. I also think that there is a really important piece to this puzzle, which is we can have the jobs, we can have the houses that are within 30 minutes of one's home, but we have to enable access to those things. And that means thinking about where can people go to get the degree or the training that they need to be able to get the job that's 30 minutes down the road or 5 minutes down the road that they really want. What are the social determinants of enabling people access, like readily available, affordable childcare, for example, having your school within 5-minute walking distance from home, not having to catch 2 trains and a bus to drop off your kids in the morning. Like, these are all the things, these barriers. We have to start breaking down all of these barriers to enable free access and easy access to all the great things that exist in our cities. And it starts by acknowledging people's experience, and also that there are really great contributions being made every single minute of every single day, and we just need to recognise that.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to come back to something Maha said as well. One of the most extraordinary things that's come out of lockdown in Sydney, I think, which distinguishes from most cities in the world, particularly migrant cities, is the extraordinary extent to which, when Western Sydney was put into lockdown, and frankly, we didn't handle it very well, at least at the start. If you look at those areas, they have the highest areas of vaccination. We know migrant communities around the world tend to have very low. But once we got the community involved and community leaders getting out the message, it is the most extraordinary story. Now, in 5 minutes, 30 seconds, between the 5 of us, we're going to say, if we want to change one big thing in this regard, Maha, what's it going to be?
I think most importantly, we've got to change the language.
Right.
We've got to name the issues to change it, not to blame. So we want to name, not blame people, but to change and be inclusive in our language. And it takes on the leadership role from top down and bottom up, so that we can take pride in the areas that we live in, and it's not dependent on our postcode that we get a job or not.
Thank you. Lindy.
I think we need the equity of opportunity. We need jobs that don't take 3 hours to get to, and that 3 hours is the norm. Our children need equity to the opportunity of internet. I think if we create transport that is the true 30-minute city, you're creating an opportunity for a community to flourish. So for me, it's the equity of opportunity.
So I'll put in mine right now because it fits so well. I think we're absolutely on the same page. If I could change one single thing with Sydney, it would be to work having an integrated labour market across these diverse communities, so that across Sydney you've got that range of trade skills, professional skills, managerial skills, the skills of the future. And I don't just mean advanced manufacturing, but as Ian has said, the skills of the future are in care and personal care, so that, again, that people are not forced to move long distances every day for employment. Ian?
You can't live where 15% of people do not have access to the internet. In health and education, the biggest issue is affordable access to technology and affordable areas. In the great cities of the world I've been to differentiate them from Sydney is actually public Wi-Fi at low cost. And actually, it's such a fundamental to staying connected. It's empowering communities which have strong traditions and strong social networks to stay in contact with each other locally and internationally, and we do not have it.
Yeah. So for you, in part, it is that digital divide.
It's the
still.
digital divide. The biggest new divide we see in education and in healthcare, really fundamentally. In the future, your GP won't take care of yourself, you will take care of yourself. Actually, the whole way in which healthcare is going in other areas, in aged care and all these areas, childcare, again, the Minderoo project I'm tied up with in the developing world is all using technology to the household. So the digital divide will be the big divide of the 21st century, and it already exists in West to East. 15% is entirely unacceptable in the current world. That's the kind of new no access to the fundamentals of healthcare and education.
Thanks, Ian. Natalie.
Well, being the last one, I've got the benefit of being able to say everything that they've said, plus, plus I think a distributed network of social infrastructure that's also connected and overlaid with a distributed network of jobs, as you were talking about, Peter. So making sure that schools, health, mental health, all the support services that we all need to be able to live our lives and enable access and to take up the opportunity that hopefully is before all of us. Those services exist across all of our cities.
And I think as we finish off this session, it is worth thinking about what each of us has in our minds of what Sydney is. I guess many people here, like me, each year pick up the Good Food Guide. And I've got the one for 2022. There are, I think, 205 places really worth eating in Sydney. 205. And so you go to Western Sydney, more than 50% of Sydney's population, and of those 205, apparently culinary skills get lost as you cross the Anzac Bridge because the Good Food Guide for Sydney has 12 restaurants in Western Sydney. And I tell you that because it is just a symbol of the way we still imagine Sydney and the way we imagine that other people imagine Sydney. And there is one profound anonymous question that comes in. Will the next Sydney summit be held in the West? There is irony in talking about the importance of Western Sydney whilst in one of the most northeastern points of the city. So the answer is yes, I am convinced that the next summit will take place in Parramatta in the Peter Shergold building. Thank you. Thank you very much.